Doc Rightwing here, and today I want to talk about something that Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, said on April 28, 2002. Roll the clip.
But what I can tell you is that it sounds like the objective of the board is to prevent disinformation and misinformation from traveling around the country in a range of communities. I'm not sure who opposes that effort.
That is either a supremely dishonest statement or a supremely stupid one. From my perspective, we disagree on two fundamental points, one of which should be obvious to anyone who isn't a hopeless moron. So let's start with the first, less obvious, but still completely obvious one. We disagree that government should be determining what's true or false at all. From a conservative's much more reasonable point of view, allowing the government to use our tax dollars to combat narratives it deems disinformation is authoritarianism 101. And if what I just said confuses you, 1, you're an idiot. 2, ask yourself if Kim Jong-un would support it. Spoiler alert, every dictator is a big fan of the government deciding what information people see. Every last one of them. Because it makes tyranny much more sustainable. So if you don't want to take a step closer towards totalitarianism, and no true conservative does, you're going to be opposed to any move by the state to outlaw speech. You'd at least be highly suspicious of it. The second, and even more obvious reason why conservatives are against the idea of Joe Biden's Ministry of Truth is because even if we did think it was a good idea for the government to weaken the First Amendment, we certainly wouldn't want a freaking Democrat in charge of it. Newsflash to the brain-dead leftists who nodded along with that Jen Psaki clip I just played, Trump voters don't want the person deciding what's disinformation to be one of those leftist lunatics that was convinced, with no evidence at all other than Christopher Steele's masturbatory aid that we call the dossier, that Trump spearheaded an international conspiracy with Vladimir Putin to steal the presidency. Clearly we'd be opposed to that. Does Psaki really believe that conservatives want a person who pushed the false narrative of systemically racist police to be put in charge of determining what constitutes a false narrative? Does she think we want someone who classified the Hunter Biden laptop as disinformation to be the final say on which news stories are disinformation? Of course we don't. And no one with a triple-digit IQ could possibly believe that. Besides, conservatives believe in meritocracy, so we certainly wouldn't want to choose someone who's been as wrong as humanly possible on the three biggest examples of disinformation we've seen in our lifetimes. Because there was no collusion. The Hunter Biden laptop really was abandoned in a repair shop while Hunter Biden smoked crack. And systemic racism is a complete fiction dreamed up by the DNC to keep its black voting bloc on the plantation. Plain and simple. As a side note, I think that's a terrible shame, but luckily there are people like Herschel Walker and Candace Owens who are fighting back against the long-standing and well-refined racism of the Democratic Party. But I digress. The shocking point I'm making is that in the crazy bizarro world where conservatives want anyone in government to censor speech with our tax dollars, conservatives would at least want a conservative who was on the right side of the three most impactful disinformation campaigns of our time. And I bet that blows a lot of tiny leftist minds. Speaking of mind, this is all just more evidence that the modern American Democrat lacks what we call in medicine the theory of mind. That is, the mental muscle that enables a person to see things from other people's point of view has atrophied along with the rest of their group-thinking brains. Therefore, to accommodate their intellectual handicap, allow me to provide an analogy to illustrate the point I've just made. You guys appointing a Trump-hating leftist to determine what constitutes disinformation is like us appointing Steve Bannon to do the job. And I imagine most of you would rather have a needle shoved through your eye than allow Steve Bannon to spend your tax dollars to censor CNN's false narratives. Come to think of it, he'd almost certainly do a better job than any virtue-signaling hive mind mob member that Joe Can't Dress Himself Biden would put in charge. But I digress. The point is, Psaki would be against it if conservatives tried to do the exact same thing to Democrats, yet she can't imagine how conservatives could possibly disagree with Democrats doing it to them. All that said, This could just be another case of Jen Psaki blatantly lying to us. But let's assume for a moment that it isn't stupidity, and it isn't a lie. Let's assume she's smart, she put some thought into this, and she actually doesn't understand why we disagree with this. Then she must be convinced that the Democratic administration's opinion of what constitutes disinformation is the only correct view. That is, she implicitly asserts that the distinction between news, opinion, and disinformation is a wholly objective one. But all that can't be true either, because the clip I played was in response to a question where Psaki was presented with evidence to the contrary, the Hunter Biden laptop story. Democrats and their media machines, including the Karen that they put in charge of Biden's Disinformation Governance Board, told us over and over again that the laptop story was Russian disinformation, remember? I'm sure Jen Psaki remembers because the person who asked the question just reminded her of it a few seconds earlier. So Jen Psaki was presented with evidence that our judgment of what constitutes disinformation can be grossly distorted by our own political biases, and yet she still asserts that that judgment is objective. Well, folks, it looks like we've reached a contradiction. We assumed her statement was smart and honest, but then she claimed that this matter has nothing to do with politics when it clearly has everything to do with politics. Therefore, since our assumption led us to a contradiction, we must reject the assumption. In other words, she's either lying or just plain stupid. QED. Please like and subscribe. Visit my site, docrightwing.com. And until next time, comrades.